you ready? We're going to have a quiz. Now, those of you that have already seen this quiz, don't jump out and give an answer. Only those who have never seen this quiz. Are you ready? As you know, this teaching is a series we've been doing on replacement theology. As you know, even a little leaven can leaven the whole lump. So does a little replacement theology permeates everything. So with that said, I'm going to show you some different pictures, and everyone tell me who you think these different pictures are of, or is there one person you recognize? Who is it? Okay, which one's Napoleon? Who thinks this is Napoleon? Who thinks this one's Napoleon? Who thinks this one's Napoleon? Who thinks this was Napoleon? All right. I am going to show you the different artists. There were 4 different artists that painted these. 4 different artists. See if you notice in the similarities. Here's the first one. The guy on the far right is the guy who painted that Napoleon. Here's the next one. That's the guy who painted that one. Here's the guy who painted that one. Here's the guy who painted that one. None of them are Napoleon. None of them are Napoleon. We think we know Napoleon when we see him, and none of us have seen him. The problem is, even with God, everyone wants to paint him in their own image rather than realizing we're created in his image. This is why the deception will be so great when the Antichrist comes. None of those are Napoleon. These are historical pictures by different artists, and they use themselves in the mirror to paint him. Well, guess what? Replacement theology is a very dirty mirror. And that's why you have a South Korean Jesus, a Mexican Jesus, a black Jesus, a white Jesus. None of them are the picture of what he looked like. Not one picture that you've ever seen of the real Yeshua have you ever seen. This is what we do. We all try to create him in our image. But it doesn't work that way. Let me see. Okay. Look at this. I want to tell you where everything started. Many of you have heard of Socrates, okay? Greek philosophy. He lived from 469 to 399 BC. He was the teacher of Plato, who was 428 to 348. He was the teacher of Aristotle, okay, from 384 to 322. And guess what? He was the teacher of Alexander the Great, who conquered the whole area for the Greek Empire. And he was from 356 to 323. Then you have Antiochus Epiphanes with the story of Hanukkah from 215 to 163 BC. He was with the Syrian Greek. And then from 106 to 43, we have Cicero, a Roman philosopher. All right. Now, let's watch as history unfolds. There was a gentleman who lived the exact same time as Yeshua did. He was from 63 BC to 23 AD. Okay, so he was about 70 years old when Messiah was born. And he died about 7 years before Yeshua did. But he was a geographer, he was a historian, he was a philosopher, and there's a copy of his book that he wrote 2,000 years ago. You can actually go online and get it. Of course, you know, back then, 2,000 years ago, the geography, they didn't know anything about America. You know, they just kind of had their own little world that he put in. But his life was characterized by extensive travels. Okay, he moved to Rome around the age of 21, which is in 44 BC, and he stayed there in Rome studying, writing, and he is most famous for a 17-volume work called Geographica, okay, which presented a descriptive history of people and places from different regions of the world that was known in his era. Now get a load of this. Many of you know this map. That's Turkey. That's where we were on our last trip. And I want you to notice in yellow is Cilicia, and there's a little town there called Tarsus. Who's ever heard of Tarsus? Who lived in Tarsus? The Apostle Paul. And you can see the epistle to the Galatians was to the people that lived in the green area called Galatia. All right? And that was called Asia. Most of us think of Asia, we think of China. But right through the top left corner is where Asia really separates from Europe. And you're going to see some other little places that I'm going to be talking about here in a minute. But listen to what Strabo wrote. He wrote that the people who lived in Tarsus, and who lives there? Paul, have devoted themselves so eagerly, not only to Greek philosophy, but to the whole round of education in general. In other words, the people in Tarsus are really smart. It says they have, when you think of Greek philosophy, what cities do you think of? Athens, Alexandria, Egypt. 2,000 years ago, this guy wrote that the people in Tarsus surpassed Athens and Alexandria or any other place that could be named where there are schools and lectures of philosophers. It was full of universities 2,000 years ago, and their main topic in Tarsus was Greek philosophy. Guess what? Paul went to school there. Can you believe it? This Jewish rabbi goes to school at a Greek philosophy school. And I'm going to prove that. But first, listen to Acts 21:39. Paul said, I am a man which am a Jew of what? Tarsus, a city in Cilicia. Now look at this next verse, Acts 22:27. The chief captain came and said to Paul, are you a Roman? And he said, yeah. Okay, let's think a minute. You know, in most countries, they know several languages. In America, they only know one, typically. Many Americans know other languages, but for the most part, not. But we see here that that Paul is a Roman citizen. So what language does he speak? Latin. He's also a Jew. He knows Hebrew. He knows Aramaic. Guess what? He knows Greek. I mean, because he also spoke in Greek. And, this guy knows like 4 languages fluently. He's very well educated. Now, here's a verse I added to your notes. Just write it down and I'll read it, but you can have it in your notes. And I want you to kind of follow this map too. You can follow the map while I'm reading. So here's Paul. He was in Antioch in Syria. He goes to Cyprus, if you remember, and then they go up to Perga. You can see what Perga is. And here's what I have. When they departed from Perga, this is Acts 13:14, they came to Antioch in Pisidia. So there's 2 Antiochs. There's an Antioch in Syria, and there's an Antioch in Pisidia. This is the area of Pisidia. Here's Antioch. It's not in the yellow, it's right here. And this area is known as Pisidia. And so they came to Antioch and Pisidia, and they went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. How many of you know that wasn't Sunday? Paul is keeping the Sabbath. He goes into the synagogue, and it says they sat down. After the reading of the Torah and the prophets, the Haftorah, the rulers of the synagogue sent unto them, okay, here's our Jews traveling from around the world, and they say, hey, you brethren, if you have anything of exhortation, let the people know. So he begins talking about the Messiah. Okay, so then what happens? They end up chasing him out of Perga. And so now what happens in Acts 14:1 and 2, they're now in Iconium. And you can see Iconium right here. Then they're going to go to Lystra, then they're going to go to Derbe. But let's watch what happens. When they're in Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe, what area are they in? Galatia, you might say the county is Lycaonia, but they're in Galatia. And so in Acts 14, 1 and 2, now in Iconium, they went together to the synagogue of the Jews, and they gave such a teaching that a great number of Jews and Greeks had faith. What does that mean? There were Greeks in the synagogue. They were meeting in a church. There were no churches in the New Testament. I know people, well, it says church. That's English. Okay, they were in an assembly, and the assembly was the synagogue. Okay, and so what does it say? Greeks were there too, and they had faith. But those Jews who did not have faith made the minds of the Gentiles bitter against the other Gentiles that were there in the synagogue. So here you have Jewish believers and Jewish unbelievers, Gentile believers and Gentile unbelievers, and the Jewish unbelievers go to the Gentile unbelievers and tell them to get on the Gentile believers. Everyone following me? Okay, so what do we have? In Acts 14, 5 through 7. And when a violent attempt was made by the unbelieving Gentiles and the unbelieving Jews with their rulers to make an attack on them and have them stoned, and that wasn't marijuana, having got news of it, they said, we're out of here. And they went to Lycaonia, Lystra, and Derbe. So there we see they're right there in Lystra, and then they went to Derbe, the country. And they went on preaching the good news there. So now, let's look at what happens in Acts 14, 11 through 13. When the people saw this miracle that Paul did, they all said in a loud voice, in the language of Lycaonia, the gods have come down to us in the form of men. And they gave the name of Jupiter to Barnabas, and to Paul that of Mercury, because he was the chief talker. And then the priest of the image of Jupiter, which was before the town, took oxen and flowers to the doors of the town and was about to make an offering with the people. Okay, so here we are. They went to Iconium, and then Lystra, and then Derbe, and they're in Derbe, and all of a sudden, a priest of the Jupiter wants to do worship. So what do we know about the Galatians? They worship the planets. They worship the sun. They worship the moon. They worship Jupiter and Mercury. So the Galatians are stupider and worship Jupiter. Okay? So that's the Galatians. They worship the heavens. So let's watch what happens. In Acts 14 and verse 15, he didn't say, you dumb people. He said, good people. Why are you doing these stupid things? We are men with the same feelings as you, and we give you the good news so that you may be turned away from the foolish things of worshiping the planets to the living God who made the planets, the heaven and the earth and sea, and everything that is in them. So we see who was the one that was worshiping the sun, the moon, and the stars? The Galatians. Now this is very important. So now we come to Acts 17, 1 and 2. Okay, Galatians. So here we are. Now, many of you were with me about less than a year ago, and we went to Turkey. We were in the Smyrna of the 7 churches. They're all in here. We went to Troas, which is ancient Troy, where they all hid inside of this big horse figure, if you remember, and then escaped and killed everybody. And so then we landed in Istanbul, and we're going around to the 7 churches. We come up here, and then look, we go to Neapolis, Philippi, which is where the Philippians book was written. We go to Thessalonica. We went there. We drove right by Berea. We came all the way down to Athens. We went over to Corinth. Okay, we were all over the place. And listen to this. Okay, Acts 17, 1 and 2. But I want you to see the map. Afterwards, they came to Thessalonica. Okay, so there's Thessalonica right there. That's where they were. And it says there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his custom was, went into them and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the scripture. So he's in Thessalonica. And guess what? He keeps the Sabbath. And 3 times, 3 weeks in a row, he's reasoning with them in the scriptures. And then look at verse 10 and 11. And the brethren immediately, they sent Paul and Silas away by night unto Berea. How many of you know about the Bereans? And all the Gentile Christians say, oh, the Bereans were smart. They were really good. Well, let's read what happened. It says, Paul and Silas left by night to Berea, who coming there went into the synagogue of the Jews. These were more noble than those in Thessalonica, in that they received the word with all readiness of mind and searched the scriptures daily whether the things Paul was saying are true. Guess what that means? That means Paul is subject to the scriptures, and they were all Jews. The Bereans were Jews. That's what it says. They go to a synagogue. The Bereans weren't Gentiles, not one Gentile there. The Bereans are Jews, and they're listening to what Paul says, and then they're looking at the Torah to make sure what he's saying is true. So being a Berean, the Greeks didn't know Hebrew. They had no Gideon Bible. Okay? It was all the Torah, the Tanakh, and that's what they were searching. The Gentiles couldn't have. They didn't know Hebrew. Okay? All right. So, in Acts 17, 15 through 17, then those conducting Paul brought him all the way down to Athens. You can see on the map, Athens is way down there from Berea, the gorgeous drive. And look at this. It says those conducting Paul brought him to Athens, having received a command unto Silas and Timothy, that with all speed they may come to him. They departed, and Paul is waiting for them. Where? In Athens. And the Spirit was stirred in him, beholding the city totally given over to idolatry. Therefore, here he is again, reasoning, not in the churches. There were no churches. He was in the synagogue with the Jews and Gentile worshipers. See, Jews and Gentiles got together. They were all together in the synagogue. There wasn't a church across the street. And he was in the marketplace every day with those who would meet with him. Okay, here comes Acts 17, 18 through 20. Some of those who were supporters, but this is when he's in the marketplace every day, there were supporters of the theories of the Epicureans and the Stoics who met with him. Okay, here he is. He's having a meeting in Athens with the Epicureans and the Stoics. Who does not know what they taught? Everyone here knows what they taught? Everyone? Wow, not one hand. Okay, is there anyone who don't know what they taught? Oh, okay, I'll share with you what they taught. I'll have one of you that know. Come on up and tell me. Okay. Let me start here. Let me finish reading it. And it says, some said, what is this talker of foolish words saying? And others, well, he seems to be a preacher of some strange gods, because he's preaching of Jesus and is coming back from the dead. And so it says they took him to Mars Hill, saying, will you make clear to us what is this new teaching of yours? Okay, I was there. Here's a picture of the Areopagus at night from our hotel room. And right next door to it is Mars Hill. This is where Paul stood and spoke. That's Mars Hill, which is right next to the Areopagus. I was there. I know. Yeah. I wasn't there at that time. Okay. Now, the Epicureans and the Stoics all began the same time, about 300 BC. The Epicureanists believed that the best way to be happy, how many of us want to be happy? We all want to be happy. Well, the best way to be happy was, and not sad, is don't want anything. If you don't want anything, how can you ever be sad? You'll always be happy, they said. It's the wanting of things that leads to pain. So Epicureans had an important influence on Christianity. The Christian idea that holy people should separate themselves from the world, don't think about their bodies or about the things they own or their friends and family, and just focus on heaven, is where you get the monasteries from and the convents. That's where this came from Greek philosophy. Now, the Stoics, who also began with the school of philosophy, was founded in Athens about 300 BC by Zeno of Citium in Cyprus. Their big question was, what is truth? How about today? Fake news and everything else. Everyone wants authenticity. Some people don't want the truth. Some people do want the truth. What they said was, there is no universally grounded criterion of truth. You have your truth, I have my truth. Are you getting the picture? Okay. It is based not on reason, but on how you feel. I feel like a woman today. I identify as a bicycle today. I identify as a bird. Okay. And they believed the best way to be happy and peaceful was just be moderate in everything. That's all it is. So people don't eat too much, even of good food, and don't party too much, but they also should not work all the time or diet all the time. They need to find a balance, like a Diet Coke with a donut. Okay? So the big question is, what is truth? Well, listen to John 18, verse 37 and 38. Pilate said to him, "Are you a king?" And Yeshua answered, said, "You rightly are saying that I am a king. This is why I was born. This is why I've come into the world, that I could bear witness to the truth. Everyone who's of the truth hears my voice." And Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" He was a Stoic. He wasn't Epicurean. We're getting into his mind, and we're knowing he was follower of the Stoic philosophy. Now, here he is, Acts 17, 22 through 28. Then Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus, actually it was Mars Hill, and he said, "Men of Athens, I perceive in all things you are very religious. I was passing through to considering the objects of what you worshipped, and I found an altar with the inscription, 'To the unknown God.' Therefore, the one whom you worship without even knowing, he's the guy I proclaim to you. God, who made the world and everything in it, since he is the Lord of heaven and earth, doesn't dwell in a temple made with hands. He's not worshipped with men's hands as though he needed anything, since he gives to everyone life, breath, and all things. He has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth." Now that's also a very important verse. He's made of one blood, every nation. So what does that mean? We all came from Adam and Eve. Yeah, there's all different races and everything else, but we're made of one blood. I say that because there are people who believe that demons came down and had sex with women, and that's the Nephilim. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. It really is. They don't have nurseries in hell. They don't have nurseries in heaven. Okay? They can't procreate. They don't have blood. And so it's dumb to think that some angelic being, no, it's just big bullies. They mated with the daughters of Cain, and that's why it says in 2 Corinthians 6:14, don't be unequally yoked together with unbelievers. Okay, this is why when the lady that had 5 husbands, and they were wondering whose husband's going to be hers, and Jesus says, you are clueless. They don't marry, and they're not married in heaven. Okay, so there wasn't some spiritual weirdo who came down, and now we have the Nephilim. The biggest problem I have with that is who gets to decide who the Nephilim are? I know all the Jews are the Nephilim. Let's kill them. We'll do God a favor. See, this is why you can't believe in strange things. Aside from that, let's go back. So here we are. It says he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on all the face of the earth, and he has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for him, find him, though he is not far from every one of us. Now, are you ready to have your world rocked? Fasten your seatbelts, and this time put on your shoulder straps. This is the airplane. How many of you have heard this verse before? For in him we live and move and have our being. Everyone say, how many have sung that song? Did you know when Paul quoted that verse, in him we live and move and have our being, he was talking about Zeus, not God? He wasn't talking about God when he said, in him we live and move and have our being, and all these people in churches are singing, in him we live and move and have our being, and he's talking about Zeus. You want me to prove it? Okay, I'll prove it. And guess how I prove things? I use the Bible. First off, here we go. In him we live and move and have our being. But look at the very next verse. As some of your own poets have said. He's not quoting scripture. He's quoting Greek poets. How many of you know there was no church in 600 BC? There wasn't any church. But Paul was smart, and he went to Greek philosophy school. And he's trying to win the Greeks by out-philosophizing them. He's trying to use, it's like us trying to convince the Muslims that Allah is the creator of the universe. Allah is not the creator of the universe. Allah is a false god. But when you try to synthesize, and bring these things together to win some, you're nuts. Look at this. There was a gentleman named Epimenides who was in the 6th century BC. He was a Greek seer. He was a philosopher. He was a poet. It was said that he fell asleep for 57 years in a cave in Crete that was sacred to Zeus, after which he repeatedly awoke with the gift of prophecy. Epimenides thought that Zeus was immortal. And he is the one from 500 BC that wrote concerning Zeus, they fashioned a tomb for you, O holy and high one. The Cretians, always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies, but you are not dead, Zeus. You live and abide forever, for in you we live and move and have our being. He was quoting a philosopher of 600 years earlier than him, because he'd been to philosophy school and he's trying to reach them with Greek philosophy, but he's speaking about Zeus. And look at this. The Cretians are always liars, evil beasts, idle. Well, guess what? Look at Titus 1:12. One of themselves, even a prophet of their own, said the Cretians are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies. That is also, he's quoting again Epimenides from 600 years earlier. This is how I know he went to Greek philosophy school. You following me? He's quoting Greek philosophers, and we're thinking this is something downloaded from God. This is why you got to know history. But wait, there's more. See right here, Titus 1:12. One of themselves, the Bible even tells you, it's one of the prophets of their own that said this. But when we just read the scripture, but we don't read the scripture and see that he's talking about one of their prophets, we assume that it has to do with something he got down from God. No, he got this downloaded from philosophy school. The lie of the Cretians, he called the Cretians are always liars? The reason that he called them liars is because the Cretians thought Zeus was a mortal. But he knew he was immortal. This is the reason he's calling the Cretians liars. Now, there was another Greek poet from where? From where? Cilicia. This is Paul's hometown. Paul knows this guy. He studied this guy. He lived at 310, I didn't know him personally. He lived between 310 BC and 240 BC. And he wrote a book called Astronomy. All right, now again, in 200 BC in Greek, did any of the Greek heathen know God? No. Listen to what he wrote. He's combining Epimenides with Aratus when he wrote that verse in the Bible. He says, let us begin with Zeus, whom immortals never leave unspoken. For every street, every marketplace is full of Zeus. Even the sea and the harbor are full of this deity. Everywhere, everyone is indebted to Zeus, for we are indeed his offspring. That's what that verse said just a little bit ago. In him we live and move and have our being, for we are indeed his offspring. He's quoting these two different Greek poets from centuries before and combining it, and Christians think they're singing about God. He's not. Here they're whooping and hollering and singing this verse to Zeus. Okay. But wait, there's more. We have another gentleman. Oh, I went the wrong way. His name was Menander. He was a Greek dramatist who also lived between 342 and 291. He wrote over 100 comedies. He did many dramas. We have his literature. It's still around. Okay? Now, listen to this. First off, let me say this about Menander. Notice when he lived. You see that? 342 to 291. Alexander the Great was 365 to 326. So we know Menander personally knew Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great died like at 30 years old. Okay, he only lived to be 30 years. Even though he conquered the whole known world, he died early. But I want you to notice when he died, he had 4 generals, and his kingdom was divided into 4 areas. Okay, you have Cassander, Lysimachus, the Seleucid. This is where Antiochus Epiphanes was, Seleucid. And then Ptolemy was another general, and he controlled Egypt. So you have these 4 areas. His 4 generals took over. They each took a different part. Well, let's see. There's something I have to also bring in. This is a lady. Her name is Thais. That's her name. That's how it's spelled, Thais. See that? That's her. She was married to Ptolemy. Okay, so Ptolemy, the general who took over Egypt, his wife was Thais. She became the queen of Egypt. Well, guess what? Before that, she was with Alexander the Great. And when Alexander the Great died, she hooks up with Ptolemy. I mean, she wants to stay in a royal position. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about Thais. Thais was known as a hetera. Do you know what a hetera is? A hetera was a type of a prostitute in ancient Greece who was an artist, an entertainer, a conversationalist. In addition to providing sexual service, unlike the rule for ancient Greek women, heteras would be highly educated and were allowed in the symposium. So here, Thais is a well-educated prostitute. Okay? Hanging out with Alexander the Great, and now she runs off to Ptolemy. All right. Well, guess what? Here is from that play, is evil communication corrupts good manners. What? What? Do you know in 1 Corinthians 15:33, Paul says, don't be deceived, evil company corrupts good manners? That wasn't a download from God. He was quoting this play about a prostitute hanging out with Alexander the Great and Ptolemy. And this time he doesn't even give credit. He plagiarizes. Are you a prophet of their own? Okay. Now, I'm not against Paul. Okay. I'm not against the New Testament. But you have to study. You got to know what you're reading. Does that make sense? Okay. This was written 300 years before Paul. They have it. You can read it. You can see it. They have these plays. Okay. So what do we see? I'm almost done. 1 Corinthians 15:33 is that says evil company corrupts good manners. Now we're on Acts 18:1 through 5. Do you see where Athens is? We were in Athens on our trip last year. And then we went over to Corinth. Notice, if you remember, there is no church of Athens, but there's a synagogue of the Corinthians. So let's take a minute and let's look at Acts 18, 1 through 5. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and he came to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews, they got kicked out of Rome. And they came to them, and because he was a tent maker like them, he abode with them, for by their occupation they were tent makers. And look again, here's Paul, reasoned in every church on Sunday. Oh, no. He reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. They're all in the synagogue. There's not a church and a synagogue. And when Silas and Timothy were finally come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit, testified to the Jews that Jesus was the Messiah. Now let's look what happens in 1 Corinthians. He finally goes, and it's his first letter to the Corinthians. And he says in chapter 1, verse 17 through 23, after leaving Athens, he goes, my mission from the Messiah is not to baptize, but to tell the good news, not, however, in the language of philosophy, lest the cross of Christ should be robbed of its meaning. The message of the cross is indeed mere folly to those who are in the path to ruin. But to us who are in the path of salvation, it's the very power of God. For Scripture says, I will bring the philosophy of the philosophers to nothing, and the shrewdness of the shrewd I'll make of no account. Where is the philosopher? Where is the teacher of the law? Where is the disputant of today? Has not God shown the world's philosophy to be folly? For since the world in God's wisdom did not by its philosophy learn to know God, God saw fit by the folly of our proclamation to save those who believe in the Messiah, while Jews ask for miraculous signs, and the Greeks study philosophy. We're proclaiming Christ crucified to the Jews, an obstacle to the Gentiles, mere folly. So what is Paul saying? He gave up on the Greek mindset. He said, this isn't going to work. Okay? But the problem is, the brand new believing Gentiles with no Torah background clung to Socrates and Plato for their moral background. Because that's all they had. They didn't know Hebrew. So all their moral philosophy was based on Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Okay, with that said, the Galatians worshipped the zodiac, astrology, horoscopes. So with all of that, all of this was to let you know the correct interpretation to two verses that every Christian has misunderstood for millennia. Are you ready to now read them with the correct understanding? And then we'll close. Look at Galatians now. They were the ones that were stupider because they worshipped Jupiter, right? He writes to the Galatians, and he says, howbeit, when you didn't even know God, you did service unto them which by nature are not gods. But now after you've known God, or rather are known of God, why are you turning back again to the weak and beggarly elements where you desire again to be in bondage? You're observing days and months and times and years. I'm afraid lest I bestowed you labor in vain. In other words, why have you gone back to the pagan calendar? You now know the biblical calendar. Why are you forsaking the biblical calendar? Why are you turning back to the pagan calendar? So the days and months and years that it's talking about here is not the biblical calendar. He's telling these Gentiles, why are you going back to a pagan calendar? Now, let's look at Colossians, which is also often misunderstood. Colossians 2:16 and 17. Let no man therefore judge you, Colossians, in your food or drink or respect of a holy day or new moon or Sabbath days, which are shadows of things to come, and the body is Messiah. Okay, now wait a minute. He's not talking about months. He's talking about new moons. He's not talking about days. He's talking about holy days. So what is going on to the Colossians, he's saying the Colossians are next door to the Galatians. And he's saying, Colossians, don't let these stupider Galatians tell you to go back to the pagan calendar. Don't let anyone judge you because you're keeping the Sabbaths. You're keeping the feasts. You following me? To the Galatians, he says, why are you going back to the pagan calendar? To the Colossians, he's saying, don't let the Galatians judge you because you're keeping the Sabbath. You're keeping the holy days. And then he says, these are shadows of things to come. Which is the real plane and which is the shadow? Okay. Well, guess what? A shadow is of something real. If you get rid of the shadows, you don't know there's a real. This is why we keep the feast, because there's a shadow of a real. And look, right there is Iconium, and right there's Colossae. They're next door neighbors. So he's telling the Colossians, don't listen to these stupider Galatians. He's telling you to go back to the pagan calendar. That all make sense? And again, in Genesis 1:26 is an extra verse. God said, let us make man in our image. That word Hebrew image there is shadow. We are God's shadow. You are God's shadow. Well, we don't need you. You're just a shadow. Hello? Looking at each and every one of you tells me God is like this. There's God. There's an image, a shadow. Every one of you are shadows of God. Which is why we don't get on each other's cases. We try to find out the God that's in you. Wow. Why would we want to tear down someone who is a shadow of God? We need to find out. Okay, I'm done. Sorry. Let's stand.